My name is Greta Aldous. I am 43 years old, and the day my family laughed me out of the will, they personally carried my entire inheritance to my truck. It was raining the kind of rain Cumberland gets in late November, thin and gray and patient, the sort that soaks through a coat before you notice you're wet. 8 cardboard boxes. My stepmother counted them out loud as my cousin stacked them in the truck bed, like she was tallying a debt being paid. "That's everything Walter left you," Marlene said, and she smiled. "Take the junk. The real inheritance is handled." I did not scream. I did not beg. I said thank you because my grandfather raised me to finish my sentences and keep my voice level even when the floor goes out from under you. They thought they handed me junk. By the time I'm done, the house they're sitting in tonight, the big Victorian up on Washington Street, will have my name on the deed, and they will have given it to me themselves. But I'm getting ahead. Let me back up, because this story really starts 9 years before that rain, and it starts at a dinner table. We always did Thanksgiving at the house on the hill. My father, Roy Aldous, grew up in that house, and his father, Walter, before him. And there was a rule older than I was that the family ate there on the 4th Thursday in November, no matter what. Marlene married my father when I was 11, 2 years after my mother passed, and within a year, she had a tradition of her own. Every Thanksgiving, after the plates were cleared and before the pie, she would stand at the head of the table with a manila folder and read what she called the updated estate plan out loud. You know the type. The woman who turns a will into a performance, who reads who gets what to a room full of relatives the way other people say grace. For years, I sat through it. The lake cabin to my half-brother Dale, the Buick and the silver to my aunt. A figure, always a figure, read slow so it would land. I never minded much. I wasn't waiting on anybody to die. I just wanted a chair that stayed mine. That last year, the year I'm telling you about, she read for 11 minutes. I timed it without meaning to, the way you count freight cars at a crossing. And when she got to the bottom of the page, she stopped, looked at me over her reading glasses, and slid a single sheet of paper across the tablecloth. It traveled past the gravy boat, past Dale's elbow, and stopped in front of my plate. 1 sheet, 4 lines on it. The last line said, "Greta is provided for in spirit." In spirit. I read it twice. The table had gone quiet the way a room goes quiet when everybody already knows the ending and has only been waiting for you to catch up. "We thought a clean break would be kindest," Marlene said. "A fresh start. For everyone." My father studied his coffee. He did not look at me. That was his whole part in it, the looking away, and he played it for 9 years like a man who'd rehearsed. Then Dale laughed. Not a cruel laugh even, just an easy one. The laugh of a man who has never once worried about a chair. "Don't make it weird, Greta," he said. "You don't even like normal furniture. You like the broken stuff." That was the cue. Marlene rose, pleased, and crossed to the front hall where she'd already stacked them. 8 roll boxes. My grandfather's piano rolls. The ones from the shop, the brittle paper scrolls in their cardboard sleeves that I'd grown up threading onto spools in the back room of Aldous Music and Repair down on Green Street. "These are yours," she said. "Walter wanted you to have his music. Isn't that something?" She set them at my feet. One of the lids was loose and I could see the top roll inside, its old paper label gone the color of weak tea, the handwriting on it my grandfather's. I knew that roll. I'd seen it 100 times and never played it because the label said, in Walter's careful block letters, "Clair de Lune. Do not play warm." I'd asked him once what that meant. Do not play warm. He'd looked at me a long moment and said, "It means, when the time comes, you'll know to keep it cool." Then he'd smiled and changed the subject, the way he did with anything that mattered. So there I was, 43 years old, kneeling on my father's good rug to gather up 8 boxes of antique paper while my family sipped coffee. Nobody helped until it was clear I'd carry them out anyway, and then Dale and a cousin pitched in, mostly so it would be over faster. If you have ever stood in a room where everyone knows you were wronged and still expects you to be pleasant about it, You already know exactly how loud a quiet kitchen can get. I carried the junk to my truck in the rain. Marlene counted the boxes out loud, and I drove down off the Washington Street hill with my wipers going, past the rusted Aldous sign 2 doors from the family house, down into the brick rows below the Narrows where I'd lived alone since the divorce, and I did not cry. I want to be honest with you about that because people expect tears in a story like this, and there weren't any. I just felt very clear, the way the air gets clear right after the rain quits. Now, to understand why it didn't break me, you have to understand what I do and why my own father once called it a curse. I restore player pianos. I read piano rolls. If you don't know what that is, picture a long scroll of paper full of little punched holes, and picture that scroll feeding over a brass bar full of tiny mouths, and the holes letting air through in a pattern, and the pattern is the music. A whole performance, frozen in perforations. From before recording sounded like anything. I clean them, I patch them, I splice the torn ones, and I can read them. Not play them, read them, run my thumb down the punch rows, and hear the tune in my head the way some people read sheet music and some people read a face. It is, by every measure that matters to my family, a dead trade. Nobody buys player pianos. Nobody fixes them. The shop on Green Street has been shuttered since Walter passed, the windows soaped over, the sign rusting. When I told people in town what I did, they'd get a kind look, like I'd said I repaired telegraphs. I was 15 when I learned what my father thought of it. I was in the stairwell of the house on the hill, and he was in the kitchen with my uncle, and I heard him say it plain. Greta's a sweet girl. She just got Dad's useless hands. Same dead-end nonsense, the rolls and the tuning and all of it. The one who got the obsolescence gene. He laughed when he said it. I was 15. I went up to my room and I did not come down for dinner, and nobody came to find me. And I spent the next 28 years more or less believing him, that I was the one who'd inherited only the part of Walter that the world had stopped wanting, the useless hands. So you can see why provided for in spirit didn't surprise me the way it might surprise you. In a family, the will is just the loud part. The quiet part had been read to me my whole life. Here is what nobody at that table knew, including me, including that rainy November night, especially me. Walter Aldous did not give me his music because it was junk he wanted out of the good house. He gave it to me because I was the only person left alive who could read it, and he had counted on that. He had bet on it years out the way a careful man bets, with no chips on the table where anyone could see them. But it took me 11 weeks to understand that, and it would not have happened at all if it weren't for an old man named Petrosian, and a Tuesday afternoon when I almost threw the boxes away. I'd stacked them in my front room and not opened them. For most of December, they sat by the radiator, and I'll admit I thought about the dump. They were taking up space I didn't have, and every time I looked at them, I heard Marlene counting. 8. By New Year's, I had decided. I'd keep the one roll, the Clair de Lune with Walter's handwriting on it for the handwriting, and the rest could go. Then Petrosian called. Petrosian is a retired organ builder, 81 years old, who shared a workbench with my grandfather for 30 years back when the shop did churches all over the county. He still lived out past LaVale, and he still called me on the 1st of every month to ask if I was eating. That January, he asked instead about the rolls. Word travels in a town like Cumberland. He'd heard about Thanksgiving. He'd heard about the boxes. You still have them, he said. It wasn't a question. For now, I said. I'm clearing them out, honestly. They're falling apart. Half of them aren't worth the paper. There was a long quiet on the line, the kind Petrosian does instead of arguing. Greta, he said finally, you are the only living soul in 3 counties who can still read a roll. Maybe the only one in the state. You understand that? That's not nothing. That is a thing your grandfather built into you on purpose, hour by hour when you were small. A man does not teach a child a dead language for fun. He paused. That's not junk in your front room. That's a key. You just have not found the lock yet. I told him he was being sentimental. He told me sentiment was for people who could afford to be wrong, and that he was simply being accurate, which annoyed me more than sentiment would have. But I didn't drive to the dump. Instead, that Tuesday, I made coffee and I cleared the kitchen table, and I brought the first box over and set it down, and I lifted out the top roll, the brittle one, the one labeled in my grandfather's hand, Clair de Lune, do not play warm. The paper was the color of weak tea, and it had gone fragile at the edges the way old rolls do, little flakes coming loose when I breathed on them. And I thought about the radiator. I'd had the boxes sitting beside the radiator for 6 weeks. If Petrosian hadn't called when he did, I might have run that roll through a warm parlor on a January afternoon to hear it one last time before the dump. I didn't know yet why that would have been the worst thing I could have done. I only knew Walter's note, and Walter never wrote a word he didn't mean. So I turned the radiator off. I let the room go cold, cold enough that I kept my coat on and could see my own breath by the window, and I sat with my grandfather's brass tuning fork in my coat pocket, the one I always carried, the small worn one with the engraving worn smooth from his thumb and mine, W.A., true pitch, always returns. Then I picked up the phone book, the actual phone book, and I found the number for the man who still had the only working role player in town, because mine was in the locked shop and I didn't have the key, and there was a back room at that shop nobody had keys to either, a room Walter kept shut even from me. But that's getting ahead again. That cold afternoon with the radiator ticking as it cooled and my breath fogging the glass, I unrolled 3 inches of Clair de Lune. Do not play warm, and I held it to the light to check the splice before threading it. And the holes were wrong. The holes were wrong. I want to explain what that means, because to anyone but me, it would have looked like nothing. A piano roll is a grid. The width of the paper is the keyboard, left edge bass, right edge treble, and the length of the paper is time. The holes fall where the notes fall. If you have read enough of them, and I have read thousands, the pattern has a shape your eye learns before your mind catches up. The way you know a familiar walk coming up the stairs before you've counted a single footstep. Debussy has a shape. Clair de Lune opens soft and spread, the left hand wide and slow, the right hand drifting in, late and high, and the holes for it should sit a certain way on the page, sparse and floating toward the treble edge. These holes sat in clusters, tight little blocks of them, low on the page, in the base, repeating in groups with gaps between, and then a longer gap, and then more groups. No melody lives like that. No human hand plays like that. I held 3 inches of it up to the cold window, and what I saw was not a song trying to be a song. It was something arranged, something counted out. I told myself I was tired. I told myself old rolls warp and the perforator skips, and 100 honest things can go wrong in 70 years of damp Cumberland basements. I rolled it back up, careful, and I set it down, and I sat at my cold kitchen table with my coat on, and I looked at it for a long time. Then I did the thing my grandfather built into me before I had any say in it. I started to read. I got a legal pad. I went whole cluster by whole cluster, left to right, and I wrote down what I saw, not as music, but as counts. How many punches in a group? Which track? Counting up from the bass edge, the way Walter taught me to number them when I was 7 years old sitting on a milk crate in the back of the shop on Green Street, my legs not reaching the floor. He'd point at a track with a sharpened pencil and say, "What number, Greta?" and I'd say it, and he'd say, "Good." The paper never lies. People lie. Paper just waits. I thought it was a game. He let me think it was a game. By the time the light went out of the window, I had 2 pages of numbers, and my hand had cramped around the pen, and I had no idea what any of it meant, but I knew it meant something. You don't arrange paper like that by accident. Somebody sat at a perforating bench, the long way, hole by hole, and put those clusters there on purpose. And the only person I have ever known with the patience and the skill and the access to a perforator in this town was the man whose handwriting was on the label. Do not play warm. I understood that part now, or began to. The paper was brittle, the way only old Aeolian stock gets, and heat finishes it. If I had run that roll through a warm parlor in January, the way I'd half planned to, the way you'd do to hear a thing one last time, the suction box would have pulled warm, dry air through paper that had no give left in it, and the rows between the clusters, the thin bridges of paper holding the whole grid together, would have powdered. The code would have crumbled on the tracker bar. He didn't write, "Do not play warm to protect a song." Debussy survives. He wrote it to protect the message, because he knew that one day somebody would finally want to hear what he left, and he was terrified they'd reach for it the easy way and lose it in the last 10 seconds before they understood what it was. He knew me. He knew I'd want to hear it, and he told me to keep it cold. I sat in my coat in the dark, and I'll tell you, that's the first time anything came close to my eyes. Not the will, not Marlene counting boxes. That. The fact that a man 8 years gone had reached forward through all of it to keep my own impatience from destroying the only thing he had to give me. The 2 pages of numbers are not money, and they are not a deed. I needed the player, and I needed to know what the numbers were counting. And for the first, I needed a key I didn't have, and for the second, I needed a man I hadn't seen in years. Petrosian again, in a way. When I called to tell him the holes were wrong, expecting him to tell me I was imagining it, he went very quiet, and then he said a name I hadn't heard since I was a girl. "You should go see Calloway," he said. "Eldon Calloway, out on the east side off Virginia Avenue. He has a player that works, an old upright Walter rebuilt himself." And Petrosian paused. "Eldon will want to talk to you. He's been waiting, I think." "Waiting for what?" "Go and find out," he said, which is the most Petrosian answer there is. Eldon Calloway lived in a narrow brick house on the east side with a ramp built over the front steps and a wind chime made of old organ pipes by the door. And when I knocked, he called out for me to come in before I'd said a word, because he'd heard my truck, he said, and he didn't know the engine, but he knew I drove like somebody who carried fragile things in the back. He was somewhere past 70 and he was blind, had been since his 30s, and he sat in a front room that was mostly taken up by an upright player piano with the front panel off so you could see the works. He had his hands folded in his lap and his face turned a little toward the sound of me, and the first thing he said after hello was, "You're Walter's granddaughter, the one with the ear. The one with the useless hands," I said before I could stop myself. "Old habit. The wound talks before you do." He laughed soft. "Is that what they tell you up on the hill?" He shook his head. "Sit down, Greta." Walter sat right where you're sitting, and he told me something a long while back, and he made me promise to remember it, and an old man with no eyes gets very good at remembering. He said, "Eldon, someday Greta is going to come asking about a role. Maybe years from now. When she does, you let her use the player, and you tell her the truth about how I paid for that piano you're sitting at, and you tell her the paper never lies." I felt the cold come up my arms that has nothing to do with weather. "He bought you this piano," I said. "He bought me this piano, and he paid a teacher to come twice a week for 4 years. After my sight went, and I thought I was done with music," Eldon said. "He did it quiet. Wouldn't let me thank him in front of anybody. Said the shop did better than people thought, and a man ought to spend it where it actually changes a life, rather than where it makes a show." His folded hands tightened just slightly. "Your grandfather changed my life and never let me say so out loud. So when you walked up that ramp just now, I'll tell you I've been keeping his promise for him for going on 9 years, wondering if you'd ever come. I had to sit with that. The man my father called useless-handed, the obsolete one, the dead end. He had been quietly funding a blind man's lessons out of a shop everyone said was failing. He'd been doing it the whole time they were laughing at him at the Thanksgiving table. "Can I use your player?" I said finally. "I have a roll I need to hear, but it can't get warm. Can we open the windows? Keep the room cold?" Eldon Calloway smiled wider than I'd seen yet. He said you'd say that too. We opened every window in that east side house and let the January in until our breath showed. and I threaded my grandfather's roll onto Eldon's cold upright with hands that were not as steady as I'd have liked. And I set the tempo lever slow, slower than slow, and I let the suction take it. What came out was not Clair de Lune. It was barely music at all. It was a low-patterned stutter of bass notes, clusters, and rests, the piano muttering to itself like a man counting under his breath. Eldon's face changed the moment it started. He sat forward. A sighted person would have winced and called it broken. He listened the way I read, with the part of him Walter had spent 4 years feeding. "That's not a song," he said softly. "Those are groups. He's counting. Listen, the rests are even. He's spacing them so you can tell the groups apart." He turned his face toward me. "Greta, are you writing the numbers down?" I already was. And here is the moment the floor shifted under me a second time. The good way. The way it shifts when you finally understand you've been standing on something solid your whole life and calling it nothing. I had assumed if the clusters meant anything, they meant a bank account, a safe deposit number, some small last gift Walter had tucked away, a few $1,000s maybe, his way of saying you were worth more than in spirit. That's what I was braced for. A modest, tender, useless-handed sort of gift. But I knew numbers. I'd grown up 2 doors from a courthouse town where everybody's people are on record somewhere. And when I lined up the groups Eldon was calling out against the groups I'd already transcribed and saw the length of the string, the shape of it, the way it broke, I knew it wasn't an account. Accounts don't run that long or break that way. It was a parcel identification number, a property, a specific piece of land and the building on it indexed in the Allegheny County records the way every lot in Cumberland is indexed, the way our shop was, the way the house on the hill was. And it was not the shop's parcel. I knew the shop's number. I'd paid taxes on the shell of that building for 8 years out of my own pocket because somebody had to. This was a different number entirely, a bigger lot, up the hill. I sat in Eldon Calloway's freezing front room with my legal pad on my knee and a number in my own handwriting that I did not yet dare to look up. And the question landed on me with the whole weight of every Thanksgiving I'd ever sat through. Whose house was this? Eldon must have heard me stop breathing. "What is it?" he said. "I don't know yet," I said, and my voice came out level because Walter raised me to finish my sentences even when the floor goes. "It's an address." He hid an address in the music. I have to go to the county building and the bank and find out what it belongs to. I rolled the roll back up, cold and whole, every fragile bridge of paper still holding. And I think I have to get into the back room of the shop. There's a ledger in there if I know him. He never trusted a number to live in only one place. "The back room nobody has the key to," Eldon said. "That's the one." He nodded slowly, and he reached over to the little table beside his chair, and he opened the drawer without fumbling, the way a blind man knows his own house, and he took out a single brass key on a loop of butcher's twine and held it out into the air between us. "He left this with me, too," Eldon Calloway said. 8 years I've kept it in that drawer," he said. "When Greta finally asks about the back room, she's earned it, not before." His blind eyes were wet now, and so, finally, were mine. "Welcome back, Greta." The paper waited, just like he said it would. I drove back across Cumberland with that brass key on its loop of butcher's twine, sitting in the cup holder where I could see it, and I did not turn the heat on in the truck even though my hands had gone stiff on the wheel because I had a cold roll wrapped in a wool blanket on the seat beside me, and I was not going to be the one who undid 70 years of his patience over a little discomfort. The streets were slick and quiet. It was the dead part of a January afternoon when the light goes flat and blue, and the row houses below the Narrows pull their shoulders up against the cold. I came down off the east side and crossed the tracks just as a freight came through, long and slow, the way they always do, moaning that low note that everybody who grew up on Green Street hears in their sleep their whole life. I sat at the crossing and watched the cars go by, and I held the wheel and I thought, he knew. The whole time they were laughing, he knew. He had already built the answer and handed it to me, and the only thing left undone was for me to be patient enough and quiet enough and stubborn enough to read it. The old Aldous Music and Repair sign was still bolted to the brick, 2 doors down from nothing, rusted at the corners, the gold gone to brown. I had a key to the front and the front room I'd kept paying taxes on, but never to the back. 8 years I had walked past that back door, a plain plank door painted the same tired green as everything else, with a lock that did not match any key on the ring my grandfather left me. I had told myself it was storage. I had told myself there was nothing in there but broken actions and cracked soundboards and the smell of mice. I had told myself that because the alternative was to admit that the man had kept one door in his own shop shut against me, and I could not make that square with the grandfather who let me number tracks on a milk crate and said, "Good, Greta, good, the paper never lies." Now I understood. He hadn't shut it against me. He'd shut it for me. He'd left it for the day I earned it, which was his way, the same way he paid for Eldon Calloway's lessons and wouldn't be thanked, the same way he labeled a role do not play warm and trusted that I'd be the one standing in the cold reading it. I let myself in the front. The shop breathed out at me, dust and old felt and varnish and the particular dry sweetness of paper that has sat a long time. I didn't turn on a light. There was enough blue coming through the front glass. I set the wrapped roll down on the counter, gently, and I took the brass key off the twine, and I went to the back door, and the key went in like it had been cut yesterday, and the bolt turned over with a sound like a knuckle cracking in a quiet church. The room was small, smaller than I'd built it up to be in my mind. A workbench along one wall, a stool, a perforating bench at the far end under a window painted over with whitewash so no one could see in, and shelves, floor to ceiling, every one of them holding boxes and rolls, and the long, flat ledger books that piano men have kept since before there were adding machines. The cold in there was deeper than the front room. He'd insulated it. I could see that now, the way he'd lined the walls, the way the one vent was sealed. He had built a cold room inside a cold shop on purpose, a place where brittle paper would keep for a lifetime, and I had walked past it for 8 years thinking it was full of junk. The word followed me around. Junk. Marlene's word slid across the Thanksgiving table with that smile. Take the junk, the real inheritance is handled. I stood in the doorway of the coldest, most carefully built room my grandfather ever made, and I almost laughed, except it came out closer to the other thing. I found the ledger faster than I had any right to, because he'd left it where a reader would look, which is to say at eye level, dead center. The one book turned spine out when every other on the shelf was turned spine in. On the cover, in his hand, in pencil gone silver with age, it said only, "For G," read across, then down. I took it to the bench under the whitewashed window and I sat on his stool, which still held the shape of him a little, and I opened it. It was not a diary. He was not a man who would ever have left me his feelings if he could leave me his work instead. It was columns, dates down the left, going back, my God, going back nearly 30 years, to the year I turned 13. The year after the year, I overheard my father in the front hall call me the one who got Dad's useless hands. He had started this the year I broke. I did not know that yet, sitting there, but I would put it together later, and when I did, it took the wind clean out of me. For now, I just read. Dates, and beside each date, a figure, and beside each figure, a short note in his shorthand. Tuning, Emmanuel Episcopal, the church organ Sundays, every other week for decades. Rebuild Callaway upright, and the figure beside it not a charge, but a cost. Money going out, not coming in. Roll stock, 3 gross. And then, threaded all through it like a watermark you only see when you tilt the page, a second column of figures that didn't match the first, larger, rounder, the kind of numbers that don't come from tuning church organs at $40 a visit. He had been buying something for years. Small amounts, steady, the way a man saves who has decided on a thing and will not be hurried. and every entry in that second column carried the same three-letter note beside it, over and over, page after page, year after year. FPT, I sat with it. FPT, First People's Trust. The bank on Baltimore Street with the green dome, the one Petrosian had said the name of without quite saying it. The one where I would have to go, the one that had been holding something sealed for a very long time. And then, near the back, on a page by itself, the numbers I'd carried in my coat all afternoon, the clusters from the roll, the counts I'd transcribed in Eldon Calloway's freezing front room, with my hand cramping around the pen while a blind man called the groups out of the dark. There they were, in my grandfather's writing, the same string, the same breaks, the same shape, written out plain, no music to hide them, just the bare number running across the page, exactly as the perforations had spelled it. He had written the key and the lock in the same book. He had made certain that even if I doubted my own reading, even if I told myself I was tired and old rolls warp and 100 honest things go wrong in damp basements, there would be a second witness in his own hand to tell me, "No, Greta, you read it true. The paper never lies." And beside the number, one word. He had written, below it, the way you'd write a caption under a photograph so that nobody 50 years on could mistake what they were looking at. 3 words and a number that turned the whole cold room around me. He had written the street. He had written Washington. I want to be careful here, because for a long moment I would not let myself understand it. Washington Street is the hill. Washington Street is the Victorian houses with the wide porches and the leaded glass, the good addresses, the families who built something. To use Marlene's phrase, the phrase she wore like a brooch. Our family house sits on Washington Street, the house with my grandfather's name carved into the lintel by his own father, the house I grew up in, the house where every Thanksgiving for 8 years I had been read out of the future at a table where my chair kept getting moved a little further from the head. That house. The number he'd hidden in a roll of music labeled "Do Not Play Warm," the number a blind man had helped me pull out of a cold piano, the number that ran too long and broke too cleanly to be any bank account, was the parcel identification for the house my parents were sitting in that very night. I set the pencil down. I remember that. I had been holding it, ready to write, and I set it down very precisely on the bench, lining it up with the edge, the way you do when your hands need a small, true thing to do, while the large thing arrives. Why would Walter Aldous hide the parcel number of a house his own son lived in, inside a piano roll, behind a locked door, behind a bank, behind 8 years of me being too proud and too wounded to come asking? You only hide a thing like that if the thing is at risk. You only build a vault that careful around a deed if you have reason to believe that someday somebody is going to need to prove who really holds it. My grandfather did not waste motion. He did not encode an address into music for the pleasure of the puzzle. He did it because he knew something about that house that the people living in it either did not know or did not want known. And he reached forward through 8 years of his own absence to put it in the one pair of hands at the table that everybody else had decided were useless. I turned the page. There was one more entry, the last one, dated 3 weeks before he passed. The figure beside it was larger than all the others, and the note beside it was longer than his usual shorthand, and I had to hold it to the blue light from the window to read it. And when I read it, the cold in that room stopped mattering at all. Deed of trust, he had written. Held in full. FPT trust. Releases to the reader. And then, the only sentence in the whole ledger that sounded like a voice and not a record, the only place in 30 years of columns where my grandfather let himself speak to me directly across the distance, he had written. When she reads this, the house is already saved. She just has to come and sign. I sat on his stool in the cold room with the whitewashed window and the ledger open on the bench and the wrapped roll on the counter in the next room. And outside, another freight came through the narrows. That long, low note rolling up Green Street and over the tracks and up the hill toward Washington Street, where my parents were, I supposed, eating their dinner, certain as they had ever been of certain that the real inheritance was handled. And it was. He had handled it. He had handled it years before any of them sat down to laugh, and he had handed the only copy of the answer to me. And I had carried it to my truck in the rain and kept it by a radiator for 6 weeks and very nearly thrown it on a fire of warm air without ever once knowing what I had. I closed the ledger. I wrapped it in a clean shop cloth and I held it against my chest with both arms, the way you hold a thing you have just understood you cannot lose. Then I took my grandfather's brass tuning fork out of my coat pocket, the small worn one, W.A., true pitch always returns, and I held it in the cold and I struck it once against the edge of the bench, soft, and I listened to it find its note and hold it, steady and true, the way it always had, the way he always said it would, and I let it ring all the way down to nothing in that quiet room before I stood up. In the morning, I was going to the bank. I was going to First People's Trust on Baltimore Street, with the green dome, with the roll and the ledger and the fork and a number in my own hand. And I was going to ask a man named Okafor to open a file that had been sealed and waiting since before they ever moved my chair.
Pleasure to meet you.
First People's Trust opens at 9, and I was on the steps at 10 of under the green dome with the snow coming down in that fine, dry way it does in Cumberland when the temperature can't make up its mind. I had the roll in a hat box padded with the wool blanket and the ledger wrapped in shop cloth under my arm, and the brass fork in my coat pocket where it had ridden for 8 years, and a single sheet of paper folded in my breast pocket with the number copied out in my own hand. I had not slept. I want to tell you I was calm. The truth is, my heart was going like a flutter valve, and I stood there listening to the city wake up behind me, the salt trucks down on Baltimore Street, a church bell somewhere up the hill, and I made myself breathe the way Walter taught me to breathe before a hard tuning, low and slow, until the shaking went out of my hands and only the cold was left. The man at the desk was named Okafor. I knew it before he said it, because his nameplate was brass, and his handshake was dry and steady, and he looked at me a beat too long, the way a man looks who has been told to expect somebody, and has waited a long while to find out who. Aldous, he said. Not a question, and I said, Greta. Walter was my grandfather, and something moved behind his face that he did not let all the way out. He brought me back to a small room with a table and one high window, the kind of room banks keep for the conversations they don't want had at the counter, and he set down a folder so old the corners had gone soft as cloth, and he said, I have been the custodian of this file for 9 years. My predecessor held it for the 11 before that. Your grandfather's instructions were very specific, Miss Aldous, and I am required to follow them exactly. So before I open anything, I have to ask you to demonstrate that you are the reader he named. I almost laughed. Of course he did. Of course Walter would build a door that even the bank could not open without me reading my way through it. I asked Okafor if there was an outlet and a flat surface and a little patience, and he gave me all 3, and I set up the small portable player I'd carried in the bottom of the hat box, the one I used to test rolls in the field, and I threaded Clair de Lune, Do Not Play Warm, onto the spool with my cold fingers in that overheated room, and I made him turn the radiator off. He looked at me like I'd asked him to open a window in January, which I suppose I had. The paper is brittle, I said. Heat is what kills it. If this had spent one winter near a furnace, we would have nothing to read. He knew that. He wrote it on the label. I held the box so he could see the words in Walter's hand. Do not play warm, and Okafor read them, and he turned the radiator off without another word. Then I played it for him, and it came out wrong, exactly the way it had come out wrong in my own shop. The melody folding in on itself, notes landing where Debussy never put them, a passage of the loveliest piano music in the world rendered into something that made a banker's mouth tighten. Because his ear, like everyone's ear, knew it was hearing a mistake. "That's not the song," Okafor said. "No," I said. "It was never the song." And I stopped the spool, and I turned the roll so the light from the high window came across it sideways, the way Eldon Calloway had taught me to read it in the dark with his hands, and I laid my sheet of paper beside it, and I showed him. The clusters, the breaks, how the perforations weren't tracking the score at all, but spelling out runs of digits, group by group, a count of holes standing in for a count of numbers, the oldest cipher in the world hidden inside, the one thing nobody in my family would ever bother to learn to read. I read it to him aloud, slow, finishing every figure. And then I opened Walter's ledger to the page marked 4G, and I laid that beside both of them, and there were the same digits in my grandfather's silvered pencil, the second witness just as he'd promised, the lock and the key written in one hand. Okafor was quiet for a long time. Then he opened the folder. What was in it took the floor out from under me, even though I had spent all night telling myself I already knew. There was a deed of trust, held in full, free and clear, on a parcel up on Washington Street, and the parcel number matched the digits on my sheet and the digits in the roll and the digits in the ledger, 4 ways the same. It was the house. The house with my grandfather's father's name carved into the lintel, the house I grew up in, the house where my chair kept getting moved. And clipped behind the deed, there was a second stack of paper, newer, and Okafor turned it toward me with 2 fingers and said in the careful voice of a man stepping around something, "You should understand the position of the property before you decide anything." I read it. The house carried a second mortgage taken out 4 years ago, and a line of credit on top of that, and the line of credit had been drawn down to nothing, and the payments had stopped. And there was a notice in the file with a date on it 3 weeks out, and the word at the top of that notice was the word everyone on Green Street knows to be afraid of: foreclosure. "The real inheritance is handled," Marlene had said, sliding me a single sheet with that smile. It had been handled all right. It had been handled into the ground. While they were reading me out of an estate at Thanksgiving, the estate was hollow. There was nothing in it but debt wearing the family name like a good coat. "There's one more document," Okafor said, "and it's the reason this file was sealed and the reason it was safe." He laid it down gently. It was a loan, older than the rest, my father's loan, from years back, and at the bottom, in a signature I would have known anywhere, Walter Aldous had quietly co-signed it and quietly paid it down and quietly never said a word. "Your grandfather kept your family's paper inside this institution for 30 years, Okafor said. Because he was on it, we were bound to protect it. When the second mortgage and the line of credit were taken out, they went through a different desk, a different officer. Nobody connected them to the old file. That is the only reason the trust survived. They were tearing the house down on one side of the building while we guarded the deed to it on the other." He looked at me. He set the trust to release to the reader. "You've read it. So I have to ask you what you want to do, and I have to tell you that you have the standing to do almost anything." I asked him the question I'd carried up the hill in my chest all night. I asked him whether the holder of the trust could purchase the defaulted note on the property, whether the person Walter named could step into the place of the lender who was about to take the house and become the one the house owed. Okafor went very still, and then he said yes. He said that was, in fact, precisely the mechanism the trust had been built to allow, that Walter had pre-funded it, that the money had been sitting in that account, growing quietly for years, exactly so that on the day the reader came, the reader would have the means in hand. "He didn't just leave you the answer," Okafor said softly. "He left you the funds to act on it." So I signed. I sat in that small bank room with the radiator off and the snow coming down past the high window, and I signed my name, Greta Aldous, on the line that made me the holder of the note on my parents' house. And when Okafor asked me, for the record, how I wished to satisfy the obligation, whether I wanted to structure it, refinance it, carry it. I said the sentence I had not known until that morning I had been walking toward my whole life. I said, "I'm buying it outright." And then I took the brass tuning fork out of my coat, the small worn one, W. A. True pitch always returns. And I struck it once against the edge of the bank's table, soft, and I set it down on the deed and let it ring. And I did not say anything else. I just listened to it, find its note and hold it. Steady, true, all the way down to nothing, the way he always said it would. I did not smile, exactly. I closed my eyes and felt the cold room and let myself be, for the first time in 28 years, a person who had been provided for all along. The phone in my pocket buzzed while I was still on the bank steps. It was the family group chat, the one I was never quite removed from and never quite welcome in. Marlene had posted to all of them, not knowing the screenshots would reach me in 9 minutes, not knowing anything at all. She had written that she'd finally unloaded the last of the old man's worthless clutter, that the dead trade was dead, that some people hold on to junk because it's all they'll ever amount to, and there was a little laughing face after it, and 3 relatives had laughed along. I read it standing in the snow, holding the deed to the house she was sitting in. I put the phone away. There was nothing to answer. She had already answered everything, on the record, in her own words, the way she always did. The consequence of the second mortgage was not mine to deliver, and I did not want it to be. The lender's own audit found it first, weeks later, when the file moved and a clerk compared a signature on the line of credit to one on a document from years before, and saw that the 2 hands did not match. That went where things like that go, to a desk with a different kind of letterhead, and my parents would answer for it to the institution and not to me, quietly, procedurally, behind doors I would never need to open. I never raised my voice. I never had to. I had spent my life being told my hands were useless, and in the end, every useful thing was done by paper, by patience, by a man 20 years gone who never charged for the work that mattered. I reopened Aldous Music and Repair on a Tuesday in early spring, swept the front room, oiled the green back door so it wouldn't stick, and turned the rusted sign right way up on its bolts. And I set up a small trust of my own at First Peoples, with Okafor's help, the way Walter had taught me without ever saying he was teaching me, so that a blind student named Eldon Calloway would have a tuned instrument in his front room for the rest of his life, and so that his granddaughter, who is 9 and has perfect pitch and the most serious face I've ever seen on a child, would have lessons paid through and a role waiting and someone to teach her to read the holes. She came to the shop at dawn this morning before school. I threaded a fresh roll onto the spool for her and showed her where to put her hands. Then I set the brass fork ringing on the counter between us and we listened. The fork still rings true.